Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Leonore Aileen. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for California Studies, and this is a collaborative partnership between the Center for California Studies, the Project for an Informed Electorate, those are both at Sac State, and the College and Career Alliance Support Network at the Lawrence Hall of Science and UC Berkeley. I wanted to acknowledge that the survey that we're going to talk about today was funded by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Special shout out to Max Espinosa, our program officer, who sort of spearheaded this whole effort. The survey was developed as we started realizing that 25 years had passed since the passage of Prop 209, passed in 1996, and a bunch of us sort of got together and started talking about what we wanted to know, what we were interested in. And I would like to acknowledge the contributions of folks who participated in some of those initial discussions, the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, the Campaign for College Opportunity, and EdTrust West. A little housekeeping thing. If you have a question as the webinar is going, please enter it into the Q&A. You may not be able to see the Q&A, the questions, but we will see them, rest assured, and we will try to answer them throughout the presentation. Thank you. Take it away, Tameka.
Thank you, Leonore. Welcome all. We still have attendees joining us, and we know you have many choices with your days and your time, and we're so grateful you chose us. It is an honor to be in partnership with Leonore and the team from Sac State. We are welcoming you into this session, which we told you don't want to miss it. We have a fabulous presentation to really capture some of the findings that were elevated in the CalSpeak survey and the responses. And Dr. Nalder will give you a very thorough overview of the findings. And then we will be joined by an illustrious panel of respondents who will offer commentary and feedback to really hone in on perspectives that are needed for such a time as now. When we think about the reality of even the discussion of race in America present day, it's riddled with a range of complexity. And so we wanted to hone in on the attitudes of Californians to better understand their attitudes, their beliefs, and knowledge towards race and public education. One of the things that I will tell you secretly is I'm wearing my Shirley Chisholm socks, just because I trust that this is going to be a courageous conversation that you don't want to miss. I want to highlight some of the features of what it takes to really design a survey that gets to the hearts of those issues that are usually implicit, sometimes subversive, sometimes difficult to wrangle with, but also invite people into the complexity of differences and diversity. And one of the things that we've learned from Dr. Amber Banks and her work at the Center for Trust and Transformation, trust is essential when working within collaborative partnerships. And if you know anything about the UC system or the CSU system or the California Community College system, those systems don't always talk to one another when we're talking about the most effective ways to partner. So we also wanted to highlight the value of the findings while also talking about this idea of movement building and practice through our partnership. And that's what's going to be represented in this experience today. So we want to highlight a few norms for our session, and then we're going to turn it over to our distinguished panelists and our presenter and our moderator. And so with that being said, next slide, we want to highlight Dr. Nalder, who will speak about the findings, as well as Dr. Annie Johnston, who will speak in a facilitated way with our moderated respondents, who we are honored to have with us, and we couldn't have asked for a better team of leaders and experts in the field. Vince Stewart, VP for Policy and Programs at Children Now, Dr. Kristina Victor at Sac State, Professor of Political Science, Dr. Charmaine Mercer, Chief of Equity and Culture at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and Dr. Jose Dios Trinidad, Assistant Professor of Education Policy at UC Berkeley. Next slide. Our virtual norms, I won't read them to you. However, we want your inquiries, your ideas, and feedback. And so although the feature for chat has been dismantled, we will create space for questions as the presentation concludes, and we will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the process so that when it's time to open up the floor for engagement, we will do so. We also will offer a survey at the conclusion of this event, and we apologize in advance that unfortunately we won't have an opportunity to answer all questions directly. However, we will create space in the survey for you to follow up with us with your questions that aren't addressed during the event, any ideas, feedback, or comments that could be instructive in planning forward. So without further ado, I want to turn it back over to Leonore to do a more formal introduction for Dr. Nalder.
Dr. Nalder is a professor of political science at Sac State. She's also the director of the Project for an Informed Electorate, which is one of the co-sponsors of this webinar. And she's also the director of CalSpeaks, which is the tool that was used to do this survey. This is a polling panel that is housed at the Institute for Social Research at Sac State. And she created this tool, and it's a wonderful tool that can allow us to sort of get a snapshot of how Californians feel about an issue. So thank you so much, Dr. Nalder. Take it away.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to point out that this survey was administered online to a panel. So what we do is we collect folks through random means to try to get a representative sample, and they participate in this panel in multiple different surveys. And another thing I wanted to point out is that this survey is from 2022, and that is relevant in some of the findings, like on affirmative action, because the Supreme Court had a decision after we did the survey. We had an N of 1,119, so that's a relatively representative survey with a margin of error plus or minus 2.9%. So just keep that in mind, that they're not precise, just like any survey. So next slide, please. All right, so we asked a whole series of questions, and we have them in categories here. So I'll go through several of the findings, and then we'll open it up to the panelists to give their input about their expertise in these policy areas. So could we have the next slide, please? All right, so the first knowledge question we asked was about affirmative action. So we said, the question was, today, California public colleges and universities are legally required to give admission advantages to students of color when they apply to attend. We had the sense that probably some folks had a misapprehension about that. It has not been the case since way back in 1996 when the voters approved Prop 209. So 38% of the respondents thought that was the case, that we did have affirmative action still in education in California, which we do not. We also had, let me also say, when I'm doing the findings, I'm going to be pointing out some of the significant subgroups that had differences of opinions. I'm not talking about every single subgroup and every single demographic here, but I will be going over the ones that sort of pop out. So on this one, younger people, interestingly enough, younger people were more accurate in their responses to this one, and liberal folks were more accurate. Next slide, please. So we also asked if people favored or opposed affirmative action programs. So we wanted to kind of combine those two things. And we did find that Californians do support affirmative action for higher education for the most part, even though we don't have it. So you can see on the left there, the strongly support is 26%. We have a range of support, but mostly it's support for that. But one of the findings is that Latinos were more supportive than other subgroups for whatever reasons. I should mention that Latinos and Hispanics, or whichever term you want to use, are measured separately from race as a category, because you could be of any race and be Latino or Hispanic. So that don't be confused about that, I guess. Next slide, please. So what we found on that favoring question on affirmative action is that, white people were very mixed on the responses to that. If you look at on the left of the left-hand figure, the Black respondents were quite supportive of affirmative action. Asian American Pacific Islanders, not as much, more mixed as well. And then people who were in other categories in terms of the race and ethnicity question were more supportive, which is, more, representative of California in general. Republicans, as you might imagine, were more opposed by kind of a long shot on that, the the figure to the right on the left-hand side, you can see that there's actually a huge proportion actually of Republicans who are opposed to affirmative action. And that's not the case for Democrats, who are much more in favor. And the folks who are nonpartisan or independent were more mixed on that. Next slide, please. So we combined the knowledge question and the approval for affirmative action here. And what we discovered was that folks who knew about Prop 209, so got that first knowledge question correct, were more likely to support affirmative action. So that's kind of interesting. So it's people who think it's happening, even though it's not, who are, more opposed to affirmative action in education in California. Next slide, please. So we also, on some of these questions, not a ton because this is really time consuming in surveys, but we asked some open-ended questions, and one of them was on this affirmative action question. So we asked them, please explain why you favor or oppose affirmative action programs after they had been asked the previous questions. So we got kind of a mix of responses. So some folks were opposed, and their reasons come out in these comments. A lot of them said something like admissions should be based on merit, not race. People said things like, I've seen people be promoted due to affirmative action who are not properly trained and supported. Some were set up to fail just to prove managers' beliefs that people of minority races were incapable. So, kind of a nuanced take on that. And then some that were more negative, like, why do more for a minority? That's the way they put it. They get lots now, prevents people from having to earn their education, lowering standards for students. So, and then there's one at the bottom there about crybabies. So we tried to select some of the examples from 1,000+ responses for detractors to give you an idea that they're kind of across the board in the reasons that they detract. Next slide, please. And then the supporters, there were lots of those. Helps correct longstanding active discrimination. Diversity strengthens teens. Many children of color are unable to attend schools of higher ed because of poverty. We're losing talented minority young people, especially in the Chicano and Black communities. Affirmative action might help get these students at least in the door. So a lot of those were, in this sort of range of positive responses about it, doing good things for society, essentially. Next slide. And then there were, some interesting ones that were really sort of mixed or had, opinions on both sides. I'm neutral in these affairs, not sure. I don't know. I have mixed feelings. And then maybe other things would do it better than an affirmative action program. So there were really interesting responses across the board. Next slide, please. All right, I'll turn it over to our panel to see if they have comments on knowledge and affirmative action.
Thank you, Kim. Dr. Nalder. This is a great moment to stop and look at what are the implications of those findings about affirmative action and how Californians understand and feel about affirmative action. So would any of the respondents like to make comments?
I can make a comment. Yeah. So one of the things that I found really interesting about this was just who knows about it and the type of who favors it. But also one of the things that I think we should be asking as well is like, how do we operationalize affirmative action? Or how do people even understand what affirmative action is? Because as is said here, there are affirmative action programs and there are different ways. And so people's preference for or being a detractor of affirmative action might depend on on what they're exposed to or what their preconception of what affirmative action entails and what affirmative action is actually doing, or what type, or even the type of affirmative action program that's there.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on that?
Yeah. Go right ahead, Charmaine.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that comment and say implicit in that for me, I heard a lack of understanding of the origins behind how affirmative action got started as a program and what it was intended to do. So I would agree with Dr. Trinidad that there should be some acknowledgement that I'm not sure if we're all responding to the same question or what thoughts or images or ideas we have about affirmative action that are actually informing respondents' views.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would definitely plus one that comment. I think in my experience, generally, there's a lack of understanding as to why affirmative action programs were put in place to begin with, and that much of that was to deal with the inequities and historical barriers that were put in place for certain communities to access higher education or a whole host of other things. So I think that general lack of understanding of what the purpose was could be reflected in some of these responses that you get from the survey.
All right, let's send it back to you, Kim.
All right, thank you for those comments. So another knowledge question that we asked was about the match between the race and ethnicity of students and the race and ethnicity of their teachers in K through 12. And so the way we phrased it was the mix of race/ethnic backgrounds of California's public K through 12 teachers closely matches that of students. So just as background, it doesn't, right? So according to the California Department of Ed, 23% of students are non-Hispanic white, but 63% of teachers are, and 54% of students are Hispanic, but only 20% of teachers are. So just in that one aspect, it's very disproportionate. So 23% of our respondents got that wrong, but 77% were accurate in knowing that there wasn't really a good match there. So the white respondents were actually more likely to get it right, and as were AAPI respondents, whereas Latinos were less likely to get it right, in spite of the fact that that they're the most disproportionate group in this respect. And then folks with higher income were more accurate on this question. So some kind of interesting things, but overall, people do understand that this is a differential. But you can see how this might impact their opinions about various programs in K through 12 schools if they think there already is a match. Next slide, please. Excellent. So related to that, we asked if they believe that teachers tend to relate more to students with whom they share that racial or ethnic background. So, does it even matter? And we found that many people were neutral. You don't get a lot of folks reporting neutral opinions on surveys generally, but in this case, people were sort of, ambivalent about it, or maybe they didn't know, whereas 41% agreed. The groups that were more likely to say agree, that they think that, the match does matter, were folks who are more educated, liberals, and Democrats. Next slide, please. And then matching up the knowledge and the opinion on this. So those who think that the match doesn't matter are more likely to get it right. And those who think that the match matters are also more likely to get it right. It's the neutral people who are most likely to be incorrect. And that's probably, the reason they were neutral is possibly because they didn't properly understand or didn't know much about those demographics. Next. All right, do we have comments on that section?
Anyone from the respondents would like to respond to that?
Yeah, one quick thought, I think, in terms of the differences between white and AAPI respondents and Latino respondents. Some of that could, I think, be attributed to the distribution of teachers and where teachers of color are teaching and what students are in those schools. So, I would posit that you likely have schools with high numbers of Black and Latino students who have an overrepresentation of Black and Latino teachers, so they may perceive more of those teachers being in the system than they actually are.
Thank you. That was a great point.
Well, I'll just chime in here quickly. I think as one thing maybe to think about as we move forward too is that AAPI group is very diverse. I mean, we've grouped them and aggregated them here for the purpose of the survey, but there's so many different groups within that group. I think we're going to see that play out on slides that are upcoming in the presentation. And I'm kind of curious, when we see questions like this, as a survey person, I'm curious to think what people are thinking about when they answer the question. Are they really thinking about California as a whole, or are they thinking about their local school district, the place where maybe their children went or where they attended? So, sometimes I'm not sure that survey respondents do the best job of estimating when they're asked to think about things like the country as a whole or the state as a whole. So I think people might be having more of a local perspective too when they answer this question.
Sense. So back to you, Dr. Nalder.
All right, if we could have the next slide, please. All right, so next we asked a bunch of questions about people's experience on race and discrimination. Next slide, please. So this is one, that scholars use to kind of gauge how people are reacting in terms of racial issues. Race no longer matters in the United States. Overall, in California, people disagree, 77%. But when we break it down by party, you see a real difference where Republicans, are more likely to agree with that statement, whereas Democrats very strongly, 92% against it. And then people who are, independents of something are more like the average. Next slide, please. So we also asked a question about this image. Let me explain it. But if your race or ethnicity has helped or hurt you, or been much of a factor. So this is kind of gets at who these people are who are responding and how they feel about race personally. And you see that on the left there, the green boxes, those percentages, 19 and 17%, those are folks who thought that their race helped a lot. 8 and 15 are ones that thought it hurt. And then the 42% on white it wasn't much of a factor. So, more white people think that the race wasn't much of a factor in how they did in life, or, if they were helped or hurt by the race. But there's a significant portion who think that it hurt them, which is kind of interesting. The Black respondents, of course, much more think that their race has been, holding them back. AAPI as well. And then folks in, whatever other categories, a fair number of them thought that their race had held them back. So there is this awareness of race being a factor in folks' lives. Next, please. So next we asked a series of questions about discrimination in K through 12, and then we did another series on discrimination in higher ed. So let's do the K through 12 first. And I should say this is public education only. We only asked about public education. So first we asked, how much discrimination do these groups face? So in this case, it's Latinos. And most people did think that Latinos faced some discrimination, but most thought it was a moderate amount. And the people who are more likely to take that view were women, people who are more educated, Democrats, liberals, and African Americans. Next slide, please. Those who thought there were issues for Blacks, there were more, right? So we had 39% who thought there were moderate issues for them, and 37% that said a great deal. And those who are most likely to say that, it was a problem were women, Democrats, liberals, and Asian and Pacific Islander respondents. Next, please. And then for the AAPI group, there's not as much as of a perception of discrimination. So 43% saying none. And then, 48, almost half saying a moderate amount, and then very few thinking there's a great deal. Those who thought there was some were women, Democrats, and members of the group themselves. Next, please. And then discrimination against whites is an interesting one. So 89% thought, no, there's not. But 19% thought that 15% thought that there was a moderate amount, and 2% said a great deal of discrimination in K through 12 for white students. The people more likely to think that were white people, people with less education, Republicans, and conservatives. Next slide, please. Respondent comments on the K through 12.
And would anyone like to speak to that?
Yes, thank you for that. I had it was really fascinating data to sit with. One kind of curiosity I was wondering was about the intersection of the diversity within groups and how that then influences how the group is responding. So, for instance, the diversity within the AAPI group, how they then are reporting or talking about their experiences with racism. And then I also noted that for all of the groups, those who were most likely to answer in the affirmative that they believe that the group had experienced something were those who were most likely to be impacted by it themselves. So that, for me, is not surprising, but it is notable inside of the survey. So Black people, women were the ones who were most inclined to agree, no matter the group, that those things did in fact exist.
Agreed. Yeah. Anyone else would like to comment?
I also thought it was really interesting that you see higher levels of maybe like cross-racial solidarity with like Latinos and Blacks, but then not the same with the AAPI group, right? So something is going on where certain groups are seeing each other as potentially facing discrimination, but then other racial or ethnic groups are not seen as that, despite all kind of living in the same state and having maybe similar experiences. I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you.
Just to add to this, I also am interested in how this plays out in other states, because here in California, we have this quite high for certain groups, and it might even be higher for other states. And just understanding that pattern, I think, is important as well.
All right. Let's throw it back to you, Dr. Nalder.
Great, thank you. So I should say, just as a side note, that we do have more nuanced responses from folks about their race and ethnicity. We just had to put them in these big baskets for statistical purposes, but it would be interesting to break it out more within the AAPI group or within the Latino group. Okay, so we asked similar questions about higher education. Next slide, please. So this is about Latino discrimination in higher ed. And in this case, we got, moderate, 56%, a great deal, 15%. So most Californians think that Latinos do have some issues, but especially Latinos and women and Democrats. And so there's a big difference between Democrats and Republicans on that one. Next slide, please. And then for African Americans, 48% thought it was moderate, 27% a great deal, and only 26% thought that we're done with that kind of thing, I guess. So the folks more likely to believe that were people in low-income households, Latinos, Blacks, and people in the other race category that, might be Middle Eastern or other categories, mixed race, maybe even. Democrats were more likely to think that there was discrimination, and liberals. Next slide. And in the AAPI group, very few people thought there was discrimination in higher ed for Asian Americans. Only 6% thought it was a great deal. 47% thought there was some, but it was moderate. And then almost half thought there's none. So that's, the highest we've seen so far that think there's none. Those who believe there is some discrimination, younger people who aren't Latinos, of whatever race or whatever ethnicity, AAPI, Democrats, but this split isn't as big as some of the other ones, 55 versus 40% for Republicans, and then liberals. Liberals just believe in discrimination more in general, right? And then for whites, most people thought there was, no discrimination, 81%. But then, 16% that thought there was a moderate amount and 3% a great deal. And again, the group that thinks that whites are discriminated against is more likely to be white people themselves. AAPI, which is kind of interesting. And then Republicans, as you might imagine, conservatives, and those with less education. Next slide, please. All right, could we have any different responses on the higher ed thing? I'm sure some of these overlap. Yeah, do people have responses? Or if you don't, we can move.
I have a response. I don't know that it's necessarily specific to higher ed, but it did strike me that the responses for both K-12 and higher ed discrimination seem to track with the national narrative around sort of this notion of white grievance and kind of this backlash against anything that's done to address inequities, whether you're talking affirmative action or other types of efforts or initiatives. So, that seems to be sort of reflective of kind of like I said, our national politics of the last 8 years.
Then back to you, Dr. Nalder.
All right, let's move forward. So another question we asked was about, is the playing field equal? So can we go to the next one? So students from any California high school can be well prepared for college if they work hard enough. So essentially, the schools do a relatively equal job at educating folks. People who were less educated were more likely to agree with that, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then conservatives were more likely to agree. And overall, we have 47% agreeing that, basically wherever you go to a school in California, you can be okay in your education. So that one is a little different from the findings of the others that were more lopsided towards thinking there's a problem. Next slide, please. All right. So we asked specific things that people might believe about multilingualism and so forth. So being able to speak more than one language is a valuable asset. Almost everyone agreed with that. So that's relevant to policies, obviously, in schools. It's important for children in California to grow up knowing about the history and cultures of the major racial and ethnic groups in the state, 80%. So the, ethnic studies requirement is relevant there. It'd be better if California had more diverse neighborhoods. 54% agree, 32% neutral, 14% disagree. But again, we get a majority thinking that would be desirable. Next slide, please. And then we asked about inequality between K through 12 schools. It's relevant to that, a couple slides earlier. And then we do see some differences here. Not all K through 12 schools in California provide the basic education that our students need. 71% agree, but you get some folks who disagree with that. Some California public K through 12 school systems have more effective and experienced teachers than others. 83% agree that there's some sort of an issue there. So there is an indication that Californians are concerned about this, even though in that initial slide they didn't indicate as much. So can we get some respondent comments on those attitudes and beliefs?
That was also another one that was deeply responsive. Like, I wonder what could be going on. I think in California, we are pretty knowledgeable of giving our education system and the link between property taxes. So I was curious about how people are perceiving what this actually means for them as they make shifts or decide to be more pro policies that would favor students or require more of the system to be able to support those students. That was what was actually running through my mind as I was going through the data about the connections between how schools get funded and then public support for funding public education.
Yeah, and I would just add that when I saw this, I was actually thinking of Dr. Flores-Victor comments earlier about how people may be focusing very much on sort of their local schools and the schools that their kids attend. And I've seen this in other surveys when you survey folks about sort of the quality of the teachers, and they think, well, in my kid's local school, the teachers are quite good, so they tend to have a favorable opinion, not really recognizing that when you look at the state as a whole, the educational system really isn't doing as well as it should be, and it is, there's underinvestment, and we see that borne out in terms of achievement gaps and that sort of thing. So I do wonder if there's this disconnect between your local perception versus statewide.
Anyone else have a thought here?
All right, let's move to the next slide, please. So then we asked a series of priority questions, although we didn't explicitly request trade-offs here, but just which things do they think are important. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this might look a little small on your screen, but so the prompt began with, if we were deciding how to spend California tax dollars, what priority would each of the following changes to K through 12 public education be to you? So finding effective and committed teachers for high poverty schools, 60% thinking that's essential. So these are ordered from the top left going down and then the top right going down in terms of how strongly people thought that was a priority. So that one was the highest priority of these for the respondents. Ensuring that young people learn to interact and work with youth of other races, that was considered essential by about half of Californians, and most people thought it was some sort of priority. Spending extra on schools with many students from groups that have faced discrimination so they can catch up, that was deemed essential by 35%, but quite important by a large proportion. Though support for that one decreases as income rises, just as a side note. Developing student ability in more than one language, again, that's considered pretty important, but not as much as the three we've already been over. Finding ways to get more teachers from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds to match the student body. Back to some of that we discussed already. 11% say that's not a priority, so that's bigger than most of these in terms of people not thinking it's a big deal, but they're pretty spread out and mostly supportive of it. Getting back to basics in K through 12 schools and quit focusing on diversity and inclusion. And we got really mixed support for this. That one obviously is the outlier in terms of ideological direction. But but not a priority, 25%, 12% think it's, second sort of a priority, 24% think it's essential. So that one is much more mixed. And the support increases by age. So as people get older, they're more likely to say that we should, not focus so much on this DEI stuff. Next slide, please. So we ask similar questions on higher ed. Well, let's go back. Let's see if the panel wants to respond to those K through 12 priority questions.
Panelists?
Would you back up one more slide, please?
I have something. It's clear here that the importance of teachers, and particularly because teachers have the most proximal influence on the students and students' outcomes. I think the other thing that needs to be mentioned here is the resources and the salaries that come along with providing more effective and committed teachers for high poverty schools. So that financial aspect that needs to be put in here is something that needs to be emphasized.
I also think about the interaction between and among them, right? So if you have effective teachers, you want effective teachers who are able to help other students understand how to engage. And if those students are also of a different race than the teachers, which given California's demography of its teacher population, it's likely to be. So ensuring you have educators who have cultural competence and are able to actually foster that environment. So number one and number two. And then by the time you get to number three, those teachers also have particular capacities and skills to be able to work with those students. So I also see an interaction between number 1 through 3, and then how the dollars would then interact would then be a thing that would come out. So the fact that people with more money and those who are more age or high or older in age, who also tend to be more politically active, are the people who don't support that. That would say they're the population of people who we need to work on.
I would say one thing too, having been through the results of this whole survey a couple of times, one of the most interesting findings to me is the frame of the question. So the questions that are framed in a way that are about kind of like it would help low income schools tend to be more popular. And the more specific we get about what group it would help, or if there's a racial or ethnic component, the support drops. Even if it's still a popular policy, the support drops from the frame of this would benefit all low-income students, or it would help all schools to have better qualified teachers. So I just think that that's very interesting from a policy standpoint, how we frame right funding policies, that the low income or like helps all students frame is always seems to be across these results more popular than as we kind of add in bits of information about the disadvantaged groups that it could potentially help.
Interesting. Thank you. Any other comments before we move on? Dr. Nalder.
All right, next one, please. So we asked similar sorts of questions for higher ed. Once again, the more support for the one that's in the top left, going down, and then moving over to the top right. So students can't get enough financial aid to pay for public. So this is what people think are problems. Students can't get enough financial aid to pay for public higher education. People think that that's, should be a priority to deal with that problem. 43%, that one's a bigger one. And again, as Dr. Victor was just saying, that's, in general, right? It's not broken out by race or ethnicity. Some students struggle to drop out of college because they don't enter college with college level skills. A lot of people thought that was an issue in public education and higher ed in California. Black and Latino Californians are much less likely to have college degrees than whites and Asians. And you saw a lot of support for that too. And very few people thinking that that's not something we need to solve. We did see that Black and Latino respondents, we're not reporting all the details here, but in general, the Black and Latino respondents did prioritize that more than the AAPI and white respondents. And then not enough Californians have access to public higher education. That's also deemed, a big deal, but not as much as the other three. And Black and Latino respondents were, again, more likely to prioritize that than AAPI and white respondents. And then students start college but don't finish their degree. That one got, less priority than any of the other issues potentially with higher ed in the state. And then Democrats and liberals favored all of these much more significantly than Republicans and conservatives, except the one with some students, which is that second one. Some students struggle or drop out of college because of their, they don't have the skills. That one there's not as much of a differential. So more Republicans and conservatives agree that that's an issue. So just as a side note. So let's back up. Let's see if there are some responses to those priorities for higher ed.
Feel free to jump in, respondents.
I mean, this is one where I was really hoping to have more information on a couple of fronts. One, it would have been interesting to see if the responses had changed if higher ed were disaggregated and separated out by UC, CSU, and community colleges, particularly as it relates to whether or not students finish or don't finish. And then also the other thought that occurs to me is, I think that there's still this perception that public higher education in California receives a significant amount of support from the state. And the reality is that it doesn't. It gets far, far less than it did, particularly if some of these are older respondents of my generation when state support was quite a bit higher. So I don't necessarily disagree with the findings, but this was one where I wanted to go a little bit deeper and get a little bit maybe more granular with the data.
Yeah, if we had unlimited time and resources, we would love to dig down on all of these, right?
All right. Any other comments on this?
All right, next slide, please. All right, so, some of the bigger picture takeaways, Californians in general do support diversity measures in public K through 12 and public colleges and universities. There are majorities in almost every measure we have relevant to that. But, they vary, and they vary by demographic groups. Some people are, in some areas are quite divided. But one of the places that, unsurprisingly, probably we see it is by party identification and ideology. So next, we'd like to open it up for the panel to give some final comments overall on these survey results.
So I'm going to ask you to step up and give your final comments.
I will start then by thanking you all for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. It's a very important one. I appreciate this conversation both as a person who's deeply committed to education. I believe it to be my vocation, but also as a parent. I think it's important for us to think about how all students who can actually thrive in the multi-generational, multicultural, multiracial society and in California is reflective of that. And so unpacking where there are places for us to identify, I guess I would say commonalities, and as opposed to only signaling our places where there's differences, is a way of designing policies and practices that best support the future of California. So I look forward to seeing how these data can continue to inform both discourse and action about education in California.
Thank you very much. So we move to EOS?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I've been thinking about was we have all of these numbers about like how much people feel discriminated, also how different priorities. And I'm really curious about what are organizational processes that we can do, whether by the government or by the organizations that we're part of, higher education, foundations, and schools that we're in. So understanding what those things that can be done at the local level, at places that we have an influence in, and also things that have to come from the government, from larger organizations that have a deeper influence on our lives. That's how I hope to leave this.
Thank you. Dr. Kristina.
I have two kind of final comments. I thank you for having me on this panel. And I just want to kind of emphasize the importance of this type of survey work. We've talked in here about, I think, continuing this kind of survey work with more emphasis on exploring the diversity within these kind of larger pan-ethnic groups, like the AAPI, like the Latino kind of pan-ethnic identity, and designing surveys in such a way that we're kind of like, I guess, getting higher quality data, right, for these groups so that we can kind of understand policy preferences more and experiences in public education. I think that's really important that we kind of continue this work. And I guess as a political scientist, maybe a comment for the Q&A is Democrats control California. These policies are all very popular, right? As we look across all these results that Kim has shown us today. And so I guess I'm left with the question of, we have popular policies in the general public, the Democrats control the state, and yet we still see these kind of inequities across both K through 12 and in higher education. So I guess that would be a kind of, where do we go from here, kind of a question for us to think about.
Thank you. And Vince.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to participate today. Two thoughts. One is I did really appreciate that the survey included respondents who were more than, or were not just limited to registered voters. I think typically when you see these surveys, that tends to be the folks who are asked these types of questions. And then building on Dr. Kristina's comment, I think one of the challenges I've seen over the years in policy implementation is, yes, California is a very blue state. So as a state, we tend to adopt progressive policies. However, there is this tension or this disconnect when it comes to implementation within local communities. I would say in many of our communities, they are far less blue, sometimes purple, sometimes quite red. So while we're passing as a state progressive policies, when it comes time to implement them locally or regionally, there often isn't the fidelity to those policies. And I think that's where we see some of the maybe the lack of progress that we hope to see, because I think and this is manifesting itself in many, many ways. But I do think that should be part of our overall sort of calculus when we look at policies and making sure that we're focusing on implementation beyond just passage at the Sacramento level.
Thank you. I think we are moving now to the closing to the question section.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, you can type that in the Q&A. Now, also, if panelists have questions for each other, that also would be appropriate.
I think we only have one question so far. So, audience, please feel free to type in your questions.
That's correct, Leonore. And thank you for such powerful and generative presentation session. As Leonore said, we only have one question, but it's a big question. So we're going to invite all of the respondents as well as Kim to respond accordingly, while those attendees out there are still thinking about the question that they want to ask before we close out. So the question that came through anonymously is, one of the things I noticed after Prop 209 passed, there was a renewed emphasis on first-gen college students, something that indicates focusing on social class. What do you think about class-based programs to capture systemic inequalities in higher education and outcomes? I can smell that brilliance at work. Please.
I mean, I'll jump in. I think, following passage of Prop 209, I think, and at the time I was with the University of California system, I think we were really searching for what types of proxies could we use in lieu of race and ethnicity. And still adhering to, what the law said, but also recognizing that we had significant populations of students who were not on the level playing field by virtue of where they attended high school or a whole host of reasons. So I think, socioeconomic status is one of many factors that you can use as an indicator of where students might need some additional opportunities and supports so that they do have a level playing field. So I guess I look at it a bit differently, but I think it's something that we were forced to do, if you will.
And politically, it makes sense, based on some of the numbers we saw here. You can bring in those folks that think whites are discriminated against if it's pitched as being about, first generation college students. And so, even those small percentage of folks who don't see, think that, do I have privilege? No, I grew up poor. I'm white, but I don't have privilege. You hear that sort of thing. And so you might be able to bring in those folks to get support behind those kind of policies if it's not specifically coded as racial, but that also may disadvantage some folks that may need it.
I want to add something here that the class-based programs is important as like a way of working around the system, but it's not enough. I remember reading this book by William Julius Wilson on the declining significance of race, and everyone was up in arms with that because it's not. Even as some of these correlate with class, the legacies of race and one's ethnicity has historically disadvantaged a lot of populations. So yes, it's important, but it's not enough. That's how I see it.
I'll just add in here maybe two things. I do think that the frame for low income helping everybody does seem to be more popular across the results. So maybe it is a more popular policy frame if we're talking about actually legislation or, significant changes. My concern with it, I guess, is I think it kind of ties us. I'm sorry if it's not going to be super clear, but I think it ties us really closely to like merit based arguments. And what I'm trying to say is there's this kind of theme of like poor working class that works so hard, and but it always gets back to kind of like a individualistic hard work gets you ahead. And so I do worry a little bit about that because the policies that are like, let's help students catch up and there are disadvantaged students seem to be less popular. But when we frame it as it's all merit and individualistic and we should reward those people with money, I worry about how these arguments get connected, I guess, to other arguments. And so that would be my one concern about the kind of the low income first gen frame is it gets very tight into this individualistic hard work, pull yourself up kind of argument.
That makes perfect.
Go ahead. I'll just only add one thing is that it didn't get you to thinking about the outcomes and not about the opportunities in a different way. So there's something about how you frame that they said about addressing or capturing the systemic. I think that's where that part gets a little challenged.
Thank you for that addition, Dr. Charmaine, and the other responses. I'm very mindful of time. We did get a few more outstanding questions in, so I want to ask for quick responses on these. The next question that I will invite you all to respond to, I'd be interested to hear more about the panel's thoughts about that prompt. Students from any California high school can be well prepared if they work hard enough. 47% of the respondents agreed. And so there's disagreement about this particular question. Any thoughts on that? And then we'll close with the final question.
I mean, I'll jump in. My thought is I just don't think that's true. I think you can look at California high schools across the state, and there are clear disparities in terms of college-going rates, in terms of access to A to G courses, in terms of access to AP courses. So in those schools, no matter how hard you work, you are not going to have the same opportunities that students who attend high schools that have all of those offerings. So, I wish that were the case, but I just don't believe it is.
Wonderful, Vince. I see a lot of heads nodding, so we're going to confirm that as the collective response. One more quick one, then I'll turn it over to Leonore. How do you level the playing field? And now all kind of questions are coming in. So thank you all for those questions. We won't be able to answer them within the next minute and a half, but we will respond if you add those questions to the survey prompts that we will be sending out. How do you level the playing field?
This might be kind of idealistic, but based on what some other people have said on the panel today, I think some of it is an education issue that voters just don't know. So they still believe we have affirmative action. They maybe think schools are better than they are, more diverse than they are. They think if people work hard, they get ahead. I know that's a really uphill thing to say, but maybe just as people are already doing, educating the general populace more about what are our education policies, what are our educational outcomes in the state, who is being harmed by current policies, and perhaps that could be something to help kind of push policy forward.
Focus on more on opportunities and outcomes. That's my quick answer.
Quick answers to a very complicated question. And with that being said, we want to be honorable of your time. On behalf of CSU Sacramento and UC Berkeley, we want to thank our distinguished panelists for such a generative interaction. We want to thank you for your time today, and we want to say to you, using the words of Albert Einstein, great spirits have often encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. We expect you to go out, be great, and have those courageous conversations about race, no matter what. Thank you for joining us. We wish you all the best. Please access the QRS code here for the survey. We welcome your feedback. We want to learn from this experience and create more programming that addresses the needs of your interests. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tameka. Thanks so much, Kim, and all those who organized this. This is really fantastic.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for, thank you for being here and taking the time to just give your thoughts. Appreciate it. Really do.